It's May 15th, 2017. My name is Michael Rupp. I'm a former member of the Department of Land Conservation and Development. With me on this interview is my former colleague at DLCD, Jim Knight. Today we're interviewing Richard Mathews. Dick's career in state government spanned more than 30 years. He began working for DLCD in 1975. We began this interview by Dick explaining his move to Oregon and how he began working for DLCD.
So working in Wichita, Kansas, and after spending 4 years, the spring of 4 years, in the basement, we decided we didn't like tornadoes. And so we decided we really should look for someplace else. And we weren't thinking about going to Minnesota or Oregon. And so it was 1974. Nixon was resigning, and we were on our way up to the World's Fair in Spokane. So we went to the World's Fair, and after that, we came down to Salem because I had an aunt and uncle in Salem, and I also had a friend that I used to work with, who then worked for ODOT, Mass Transit, and so I stopped and saw him. I left a new resume with him, and then we just came back to Wichita and working there I was there for a couple of months and got this phone call from a Walt McCallum. And he says, we've been going through interviewing 3 sets of interviews, and we just cannot find the person we want to, as an economist, to help us out with these goals. What they needed was somebody that could review the goals, determine what the cost benefits were, and then report those out to the staff and to the commission.
This is after they were adopted?
After what? This was after. This was after.
In 1975.
In 74.
Well,
They were adopted in
December of 74.
December of 74.
74,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And then we moved on. Well,
Yeah. So we arrived.
So he was anticipating that we're going to have to do some financial analysis of the goals as they come through the...
It was focused on the coastal goals that were coming out.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I said, well, it's a long trip, and they weren't going to pay for their tickets.
Of course not.
I said, can you do this? Can you go through your interviews, and if you're still interested, give me a call. And we got a call back from Walt and says, we are still interested. Can you come out? I said, sure, I'll do it. So I flew out in October, went down and interviewed, and Walt was interviewing, and
Herb Riley? Or
no. Kogan.
Oh, okay.
Arnold.
Kogan and Walt McCallum interviewed me, and Dick Engstrom was sitting in on the interviews. It's kind of odd, but I went through, and at the end of the interview, Walt got up and got Arnold. Arnold came in and says, "Yep, you're hired. Will you take it?" I said, "Sure, I'll take it." And so.
Was that sort of sight unseen in a way because you hadn't talked to other staff at all about what it was like and anything?
I never made it down to the basement to talk to you. It's like I was just in the door and out the door, out of the airplane, went home. and
Threw stuff together and came back out.
Yeah. And told my spouse, we got to, and I talked it over with her and says, yeah, let's do it. And,
when I came back to my hometown, we got engaged.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. And then Pat and I came out, and we were married on the beach.
Oh, yeah.
This is all private stuff. Not private, but not part of it.
It's not private anymore.
But everybody's got their story about how they arrived here if they came from out of state.
Yeah.
Seems like.
And Kate was teaching at a very small country school outside of Wichita. And so we started, we gave notice to our directors and so on. And loaded up that was the end of about November 1st or so, we started loading up the van, and we got that loaded up, and then we went back to Spirit Lake, our hometown. The van was on its way, and spent Christmas there. And then the New Year's Day, got up and started driving.
Wow.
A little sports car driving out to Oregon. And so we got to Oregon, and my aunt and uncle offered to keep us in the, put us up in the basement. So we put most of our stuff down there. And then I went to work.
In the basement.
In that basement.
Sorry, I had to throw that in. You knew that was coming, right?
Basement to basement.
Both of you have to understand that when I was working with the county, and if I go to other counties, all planning departments were in the basement.
You have to work your way up.
Well,
Rarely did you make it to the main
the
floor
one
of
in
the
the river was
courthouse.
in this jail. Remember that one?
Some of them should have been jailed. No.
Yeah,
That
that's-
was a good.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
So, Monday morning, January 5th, go to work, come in the door, and they said, well, yeah, we'll go down, and they did a quick, had signed some papers and so on. And so then I came down to your office, and Brent was there, and Brent said, there's something you might want to know before you get into get too much into the day. And then Brent started laying out all of the controversy that took place. Now it's going, I had no idea it was going on. But the thing with AOI sitting in, Osberg was not there, and any other environmentalist groups were
Right.
not there. And so there was a big, big uproar in terms of how I was hired. Nobody knew me. No one had idea what I was like. Whether it was a business economist or a real economist or what. Anyway, and it was really disturbing. I mean, we had just
Yeah,
moved, quit a job.
Yeah.
Neither one of us had jobs. Yeah, all this turmoil going on. So I called Kate, and I said, Kate, you may want to wait
before you
don't unpack too much until we know what's going on. Well, Arnold Kogan resigned the next month. Al Bronner came in. So things moved pretty quickly.
pretty tumultuous, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you survived.
I survived.
Okay, so let's see, so
I've
did
got
they,
some questions in terms of what I did. I guess go ahead.
yeah, well, go ahead, if you want to fill in more. I know you ended up on the coastal program, and I don't know if that, when you got hired, that was the intention, but somehow, I know when I came, you were leading the coastal program, if I recall.
You went right into the coastal.
And that's because the goals were, I guess the hearings had started,
That's.
or were
I
they?
think the first hearing. I don't know whether the first hearing was held yet or not.
Okay.
But
So when you got there, what assignment did they say you were
my
gonna do?
assignment was to assess each consecutive drafts of the coastal goals, and then report back in terms of what, roughly, what they might want to tweak. What the impact might be.
Based on
But-
economic impact of the goals?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And what I had a coastal goal advisory committee, work groups we had. I think there were several others around that too. I think one for each goal. But anyway, I was dealing with the economic impact one, and so we had.
Now, were those folks that were formerly from Oregon Coastal Conservation Development Commission? Did they bring
They weren't over yet. They came later.
Okay.
Yeah. So on
I don't know
my
whether
committee.
Wilbur Turnick was involved and some of the
Oh,
folks
yeah.
that, yeah.
Yeah. Individually they came.
Bill Grile.
Bill Grile, Russ Beaton was on the committee. I can get the list. So,
Yeah. that's-
anyway, so we went very methodically through after each hearing, we would come, we started out and pretty much just tried to identify what the hot spots were going to be, what we really needed to address. And then I would take that information back, summarize it, send it back out to the group, and then we'd set a date for another meeting, gathering. And so we probably had six different meetings over the time of that.
This is basically 1975?
Five.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So were you basically in charge of the goal adoption process, or did they hand that off all to you, or were there other staff
Oh,
involved
no,
too?
not the whole goal
Okay.
adoption process. I was pretty much.
Who was leading that? Who was the?
Well,
point
we
person?
had Ted LaRoe,
Ted LaRose.
Okay,
yeah,
okay,
and Squire,
okay.
Paul Rudy?
Paul Rudy was on the
at that time?
commission then.
Commission then.
Yeah, so he would have been knowledgeable
So,
about
yeah.
what was going
Yeah.
on. Was Ann, wasn't on the wait, she wasn't on the commission yet?
No.
Okay.
Well, she first came on as a representative of Oregon Shore Coalition.
Oh, okay, okay.
And then she testified a couple of times at hearings before came on as.
Okay.
Yeah. But,
So Ted LaRoe, and he was on loan from NOAA, I think,
yeah, it's Noah,
because he was federal
Yeah.
employee.
yeah.
And I met him in we had hearings in
Uh-huh.
Douglas County, or at least meetings in Douglas County.
Brilliant fellow.
Yeah,
But, he just ran up against Wilbur Turnick's port directors and so on.
Oh, all kinds of county
Sort of
commissioners that
difficult, yeah, time
felt a
for
power
him.
grab coming.
But,
and so-
he was very adept at working with him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How did Douglas County, just as an example, deal with Dick and the whole idea of sort of the coastal goals and sort of matching them up with you guys?
Well, it was interesting because we were involved with the Oregon Coastal Conservation Development Commission, and Al Flegel
Yeah.
was our former county
Uh-huh.
commissioner,
Yeah,
and of course, majority leader of the Senate, and then he had a heart attack and he ended up wanting to stay in politics, and so he ended up being a county commissioner. I don't know if he got appointed and then ran, or if he ran. And
well, we used him as
But then after-
we paid him as a consultant too.
yes, and then after
Go in.
his time with the
Yeah.
Douglas County, he ended up getting hired with LCDC
Yeah.
for department. But Al was one of the old time politicians, and he could, he knew everybody and knew all the folks, and he was a very interesting fellow.
There was one story about Al up in Clatsop County. He was talking to the county commissioner, and he was having difficulty getting this guy on board in terms of the coastal goals and so on. At one point, Al took out his cane and slammed it down on the desk and said, "You get with this program." I guess he
And
came on board.
That was not uncommon. I've
Yeah.
got stories about Al and what he.
And we have oranges being thrown too later on.
That's in the department. So, but as far as Douglas County goes, we were attuned to the coastal program because we would go to the meetings, Oregon Coastal
Uh-huh.
Conservation Development meetings. Actually, Bob Bailey was working for Coos County at the
He
time.
was, wasn't he?
Yes, and he and a fellow named Bob Gerdes Bob was the planning director, and Bob Bailey was probably assistant director or something. And so I met Bob when he was in Coos County, Bob Bailey, that is. And then Greil came later. And I don't know how long after when Bob Bailey came here. I don't know whether, I think Gerdes was still there for a while, and I don't know
Yeah.
how that transition worked out.
Yeah.
But the coastal counties weren't always necessarily, they weren't antagonistic automatically, but it grew pretty quickly.
Yeah, yeah.
Mostly because I think OCC and DC left. It ended up coming in to be, staff would come to the department, Peter Watt and, trying to think of Glenn
And Hale,
Glenn Hale.
well, no, Glenn came on, but
he was former commissioner.
I forget Glenn's name that was a staff member. Really good guy. Donna
There's
Hepp,
Peter
and
Watts.
Becky Craig,
Yeah, Becky
and I
Craig,
know Becky
Neil
came
Coden.
here. Yeah, Neil, I didn't know Neil when he was at OCC and DC.
Yeah.
I knew Peter and, forgot Glenn's name. Glenn was the lead person, and then of course Jim Ross.
Yeah.
And so when they came here, I think that might have, the counties had an affinity for OCC and DC because they knew everybody and they worked with everybody. And there wasn't any enforcement. I mean, it was all kind of, trying to work with the federal program, and I didn't get the sense that the enforcement came out of that program. But then once the coastal goals were adopted, that's when, coastal counties kind of got their backs up a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. It was a interesting transition also.
Yeah.
With the staff coming over. I think there was some feelings on their part that they were, they would have rather been on the coast, and they didn't quite know how to interact or integrate into the rest of the program
Right.
staff at
Right.
the time.
Well, they didn't come across, I don't think, I mean, the approach wasn't as regulatory as it turned out to be under the, the LCDC program.
Yeah.
Goals were mandated, and they had to,
Mhm.
once they got adopted, people had to have plans that complied. And I don't think OCC and DC, they were working on a lot of issues, but that operation was so unbelievable. There was like 30 members of the commission or something, 33 or something. I mean, it was just,
Huge.
talk about herding
Yeah.
cats or
Yeah,
whatever.
cats, yeah.
Anyway,
Well, the coastal goals, they weren't part of the first 14 goals.
Right.
They started really in January. They really got underway in terms of starting the work groups and preparing for
So this
hearings
is of
and so on.
1976 then?
1975.
75.
Yeah.
Okay. When were they adopted?
December again
Oh.
of 75.
Okay.
And LB said, "You're not leaving, you're not having Christmas until we get these adopted." And of course, we got them adopted. Our responsibility with the coastal goals was kind of leading the economic subcommittee. And as I said, it's kind of following each successive issue of the drafts and reviewing those and so on. Evaluating the economic impact. And after each hearing, we'd go back and summarize that, send it back out to the work groups or anyone else that was interested, and then see my crickets.
So how would you assess the economic impact? Does the language change require, in your mind, something different economically, or it would affect the economic aspect of a region or an area?
Address it further on down too.
Okay, sorry. I
Um,
didn't mean to-
There were several interest groups, very strong interest groups that got involved.
Okay.
Georgia Pacific, WETA, and
WEDA,
WETA, yeah.
sorry,
And what is
they-
that? What is we?
Western
Western
Environmental Trade
Environmental
Association.
Trade
Okay, yeah,
Association.
remember the name now, yeah.
And they attended every single hearing.
Right.
And I think almost all ports participated
Yeah.
in commenting on
Yeah.
it. There was not a revision that went through without almost 90% of the ports commenting on it and others. And there were also comments about, well, tweaking it to make them better,
Right.
stronger and so on.
So you would react to comments then in your analysis, basically, whether, like if a port said, I think it's gonna do this, and it's gonna have a detrimental effect, you would be able to say, well, that's not quite, I mean, based on what other ports have said and other things, you would help reshape the program that way? Is
Well,
that-
we reshaped the program and reshaped
The
the
goals.
discussion.
Yeah,
Because with the interest groups that we had, well, we would have a hearing. LB would call me up to the table. I've been in the state for what, 2 months? And people would testify, and at the end of the after them testifying, LB would say, "Well, Mr. Economist, what's the impact of this?" And I've always been kind of a left-hand economist, and so it just. But we went through a hearing or two like that, and then we started getting a little more formal at it. One thing that really helped was Ed Whitelaw coming in and bringing in the concept of the social benefits, net benefits. And I think that changed the whole discussion.
yeah.
And I think it took the antagonism away that we had that, because people could see, okay, I don't need to be so concerned about getting this out of this goal because they're talking about how it's going to benefit. And that's all I wanted, where we had this negative benefit here, and switched, moved the discussion to, well, this is how we can accommodate this, and then they start tweaking it. I think we went, I think the only way we came out with a good set of goals at the end was that process.
Now, they ended up being more prescriptive than the other goals. And-
Much more.
And that probably was a good thing in your mind? I mean,
It was
or maybe it was
absolutely
necessary based on the way
absolutely
the drafts.
necessary.
Yeah,
Yeah, Yeah.
from all the discussions, it
Yeah.
ended up.
But, yeah, the interest, timber industry was, for every 200-foot setback, they would lose 200,000
Yeah,
board feet of wood and so
Right.
on, and they all had their own interests that were coming in there.
fishing industry, I'm sure was.
Did you find that
Fishing
the
industry.
counties, as opposed to the interest groups, would have more or less agree with the interest groups, or would they have different? Because the whole idea was ultimately get to acknowledgement.
Yeah,
That was the main mission we had in those early days, or not just early days, it went on for 10 years. But did you find yourself often having to deal with differences from the local governments versus the interest groups versus citizens generally? Or I'm just curious how you, not you personally all the time, but just how the agency dealt with those various constituencies. And the counties, of course, and the cities were the ones that were going to have to actually put these goals,
Yeah.
if you will,
Yeah.
into their plans and policies. And also, not just the plans, but also into the ordinances. Especially the coastal goals, because they are much more prescriptive
Mhm.
Right.
than, say, goal 5 or something like that, you know. I'm just curious what your memory brings back to the surface.
Well, I remember the debates over the classification of the estuaries.
Yes.
oh,
You know,
yeah.
That was,
Oh, man.
Hot.
it
That
was.
every port director was.
Right. Everybody
so
wanted theirs to
important.
be
Yeah,
heavy
exactly.
development or whatever, I forgot the terminology,
Yeah.
but,
Yeah.
and so to have those, identified in the plan as ones that couldn't be touched versus ones that could be fully developed
Yeah.
was a big controversy.
I think there was contention
Oh.
throughout the process, up until the very end.
Sure.
But I think the process of going through and getting back with them, saying, this was your concern, and this is how we are
We
addressing
addressed
it.
Yeah.
At least that moved it a step down. They may still disagree with it, but they might say, okay, that's,
At least you've listened.
Listened,
and
one.
Yeah,
and then two, I think I'm getting something out of this,
yeah.
and then we can move on.
Were there, I know when we had the talk, when we had discussions about the other goals, we'd get a little bit of coalitions where you'd have, the metro area wanting something and the other areas not wanting it or maybe
Mhm.
being against it.
Mhm.
And did you have cities and counties speaking with one voice, or were they generally, cities felt more comfortable with something and counties didn't like? Counties in general probably just didn't like regulation. I don't know that they had a position as to what it ought to be, but they wanted to have control themselves, didn't want the state to do
Yeah.
it. But you had other folks that probably, for example, the timber industry generally wanted a common set of regulations
Mhm.
amongst everybody.
Mhm.
They didn't want
Mhm.
each jurisdiction to have their own rules
Yeah.
because they wouldn't know how to, they'd have to, cost them a lot more money to do any business at all if they had to.
What's wrong with forced practices?
Yeah.
Isn't that enough?
Yeah, so there would be a coalition, kind of coalescing around that concept. I think Dick Benner was the Thousand Friends person. I know he was at OCC and DC, so
Mhm.
Dick probably followed the coastal
Yeah.
program pretty carefully.
Mhm.
Do you remember what some of the positions were between the interest groups? What were they advocating or, and I don't know WEDA that well. I remember the name, but I don't remember working or getting on their wrong side when
Yeah,
I
I
was
don't
with the
remember
county.
too much of what the back and forth between cities and counties
Okay.
for their own jurisdiction.
They generally wanted, they just wanted to have regulations themselves and didn't want the state to be involved, or,
Well, I think at the beginning, they didn't want the state involved at all.
okay, yeah,
Yeah, and they said, well, why do we need this?
yeah.
We have the Shorelines Act, and McCall did enough, what do you know now?
Well, the
That kind of
beach
stuff.
bill, yeah.
But, yeah, everyone had their concerns. But my list of people that were really participating, interest players, were Port of Gold Beach, but the ports basically, Douglas County Board of Commissioners, Tony Kuhn, and
Yeah.
the Home Builders Association. I think the rest,
We've already talked about it a little bit, probably.
yeah, but Ed Whitelaw, the whole thing with WEDA and Georgia Pacific, and you know the number of communications that Roger would send out to To
This is Roger Kirshner.
Kirshner, yeah.
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 Oh.
Ed handled,
Okay, you were saying something about citizen involvement?
yeah, I think, I have never, ever, I know there's no other state that has gone through an extensive process as Oregon did during the hearings, and not the hearings, but the workshops. And they could not have delivered what they did to the Oregon legislature without having gone through all those discussions. Everyone got involved. They may not have liked it all, but they participated. And it made it gave them ownership. And had they tried to go into the legislature with that and get the bill passed, they would never have done it. Because you have this mass of people out there that would not have had any contact with it, didn't know anything about it, and why weren't we involved? I think really that started the whole program.
When did the rules come into effect? Did we have coastal goal rules? We did, didn't we? Administrative rules? Or were the goals, those 4 goals,
Well,
were they specific?
because they were so prescriptive, I
Maybe
think
they
most
did.
people started out doing their planning just using the
Yeah.
goals.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because around the same time, or maybe a few years after, the white paper, you know, if you remember, the white papers were developed for many of the other goals. Counties were having trouble getting plans through the department. I remember from my perspective, we would submit something up as a draft, and it'd come back and said, no, it doesn't meet it. Well, what are we shooting for? And then finally, the folks that had, I know the forestry goal, probably goal 5, Claire, Ron and goal 3. I don't know whether housing folks did things on housing, but they came out with white papers to say,
Yeah.
this is what we're looking for.
Yeah.
This is what you have to do to achieve compliance. And then, of course, those got appealed to the court, and the court came back and said to the commission, basically, well, this is from the department. The commission has to adopt it for it to be legal. And so you're gonna have to go through a rulemaking exercise. And you have the ability to generate and adopt rules that basically say a lot of what the white paper said, but nonetheless, because the commission had adopted them, they became legal then. And so that whole process took probably a few years, I'm guessing, to get up through the Court of Appeals and so forth. But anyway, and I don't know whether the coastal goals, I don't think jurisdictions may not have liked the coastal goals or didn't agree with all aspects of them, but I sense, my recollection is because they were so precise, that people knew how to at least achieve them, achieve compliance, generally.
I think that's one of the things they bought into.
Yeah,
Yeah, this is so exact, I don't have to worry about it. As long as
Yeah.
I do this, I'm okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
They knew how to identify shorelands and go through this process and identify the estuaries and go through the process
Yeah.
for. And then, I don't know whether achieving acknowledgement under the coastal goals, I mean, I know you had battles, as we all did with varying aspects of the goals, but I don't remember them coming and going as often as the rest of the plans. And I could be wrong there, because I wasn't in the program at that point, but in other words, once you developed your
Yeah,
addressing
I
the
don't-
coastal goals, you might have worked with the department to see whether you acknowledged, and once you got it up to the commission, it probably was accepted more easily than the other goals were. You remember whether they were sent back for the not meeting the coastal
I
goals?
don't think it was that much.
At least for most jurisdictions.
Yeah.
There were some that wanted to fight or
Uh-huh.
argue, and then they would have gone back and forth,
Yeah.
but I think the others that went through and identified the estuaries appropriately, they shouldn't have had a lot of controversy once that decision was made. Okay, that's,
Yeah.
yeah, just trying to recollect.
Yeah. Ed Whitelaw.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Ed he was instrumental. I don't think it could have been, they would have gotten adopted eventually, but he was able to step in and do things or say things the staff, we could not. We worked for the state, worked for the agency,
Yeah.
and we can't.
And
go
Ed was
very
from
far beyond
University of
that.
Oregon.
And Ed is from the outside, University of Oregon.
Yeah.
And he called Weta up on.
Rita.
Rita, and let me give you some quotes of Ed.
Oh, okay, sure.
This is regarding Weta.
And that's the Western Environmental Trade Association,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
And
George Cassidy was the president, and Dave Taggart was the major speaker that followed the commission around in the hearings. It is unfortunate, but perhaps inevitable, that organizations such as WETA exist. I trust that LCDC and the legislature will mobilize those resources necessary to diminish, if not eliminate, the effects of WETA's fallacious arguments and disrespectful practices. Here's the best one. And this is in writing, and I can probably get to that.
that's good.
Furthermore, WETA's attempts to peddle its shallow discussion and serious economic analysis is a sham. As a professional economist, I would find it lamentable, even disastrous, if WETA's presentation became the prototype for the economic analysis associated with LCDC and land use planning in Oregon.
Wow.
That's a mouthful.
So what did he really think?
I know. I remember one night after a hearing we're getting close to the adoption, and LB.
Adoption of the goals.
Of the goals, yeah, coastal goals, and I think we're over in room 5, the Capitol basement, and yeah, it was. That's when LB came up behind Wilbur Turnick and said, "Wilbur, you're not gonna do any harm here tonight, are you?" As he so easily does.
He should have said, if you don't, I won't.
Yeah. Well, there were still some issues on what is testimony that LB wanted resolved by morning, the next morning of the hearing. And so that was about 10 o'clock when we ended. We went over to the office, Ed, I, and an employee of AOI.
Association of Oregon Industries.
Yeah. And he was helping us. But we came up with some testimony, went back the next morning, but we got out of there about 12 o'clock at night. Went back the next morning and resolved everything.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, but it was
That's something the audience should understand about working with the department, and that the focus on folks was about the job and how dedicated people were. And it was not uncommon, I know from my experience and yours, and I'm sure Jim's,
Yeah.
to work. I remember being in the office at 1 a.m., still
Yeah.
finishing a staff
Yeah.
report, because you had to get it in the commission book so the commission would have a chance to have
Read it and then vote
have a
on it.
week,
Oh, yeah.
week or two to read it before
Mhm.
the meeting. And
Yeah.
we just had deadlines that had to be met regardless of what you were getting paid to do. You just stayed to do it.
Well, Friday nights,
Yeah.
once a month, we'd be assembling, going around the table, assembling all the notebooks about that thick. Hal Bronner, was there, and we'd finally close up shop, go down to Boone's, had a long table about like this, drink beer and go home.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that would be, midnight probably, or,
Midnight,
yeah. I mean, pretty amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing. It's amazing they got through those notebooks.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Ann Squire could quote you
I know.
every single word for
I love
phrase in
it.
it.
Well, we will say that when we were writing, we generally wrote to Ann because we knew she would read it. And some of the other commissioners did their best, and some of them probably didn't open the book until they
Yeah.
got to the meeting.
Yeah.
But you always knew Ann would have read every word that was said, so you
We
had
need to
to,
get her interviewed too.
yeah.
What's that?
We need to have Ann interviewed.
Oh.
Probably not in this
Well, we
round.
talked to,
Anyway, go ahead, sorry.
Okay,
anecdotes, like a couple more.
okay, go ahead. Yeah, these are great.
Oh, so Jim, were you at the hearing towards the end over at Florence?
Probably.
And it was
but I don't
sleeting.
remember. No, go ahead.
Ice,
Go ahead, what?
and the sleet was coming down, it was freezing. And I think, I may have flown over with LB,
Flown over, wow.
or I think that was the time I flew over with LB.
Wow.
And so we drove then from the airport in and came up to the hearing, and we look out, and I look up, and this big old log truck. And you know the way they have the back wheels up when they're not hauling and the thing goes up?
Yeah, yeah.
An effigy of LB Day hung. I say to myself, this is going to be a tough hearing. And LB just laughed.
He was used to it.
Yeah, he was. Well, his
The DEQ
history, his occupation.
experience was a good testing ground for him. I mean,
Yeah.
Governor McCall said, get in there and straighten things out.
Yeah,
So it was about DEQ, so.
yeah.
And then when he was made chair of the commissions, some people didn't like it at all, but other people thought, well, we'll get a job done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One way or another, we'll get a job done.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Incredible guy.
Yeah.
One more.
Go ahead.
Bob Courtwright was our field rep, North Coast. Joe Courtwright was the field rep for Oregon Economic Development Department. And so I'm talking to the Board of Clatsop County. And
By the way, for the audience, they really are identical twins.
they are identical
Yeah,
twins.
it's really hard to tell them
Yeah.
apart until you get
Yeah.
to know them.
And so I'm getting into this conversation 2 or 3 minutes, and I realize this guy isn't even talking about what I'm talking about. And I say, "Are you I'm talking about Bob Courtwright, your field rep up there." Bob Courtwright? No, it's Joe Courtwright. They looked just the same.
Yeah.
And he got through had 2 different visits on separate occasions.
Yeah.
And this guy didn't realize that they were representing 2 different agencies.
Wow, yeah. That definitely could have happened.
Yeah.
You could only tell them apart when they were together, because if you knew Bob and Joe, Bob in particular, because we work with
Yeah.
Bob. But if they weren't together and you saw them individually, it'd be really hard to tell which is which,
Yeah.
unless you
Yeah.
knew them.
Oh, there was one night at Boone's after we closed up the notebooks. I think Bob went into the restroom, came back out, and then Joe went in, came back out, where they had changed sweaters. So we were talking to each one as though,
They did it on purpose.
yeah, they did it on purpose. This is something.
Did you find yourself enjoying working for the department?
Very much.
You did.
Well,
I mean, obviously,
I-
yeah.
the day I was eating breakfast, and the hearing was over in the coast, the
Yeah.
coastal goal hearing, and I'm reading the newspaper, and it talks about me being fired because I released some type of report to the press. Shouldn't have done that. But Mosser said,
John Lawson.
that guy's fired. And it was in the paper. I said, oh, so I go in, and Hal just got back from the coast, and he says, don't worry about it. He just had to say something like that. Don't sweat it. But that's awkward.
Okay, some Oregon land use observers believe that the approval of Senate Bill 100 was possible because of the time period in which we lived, the 1970s and the birth of the environmental movement. The enactment occurred because of the convergence of 4 key factors: vision, leadership, federal money, and luck. What do you think? Do you agree or disagree, or do you believe there were other factors that were critical to the passage of Senate Bill 100?
I agree with that, with all 4. If it had not been for the vision of McCall and Straub and others, there's no way that anything would have been passed. We would have had development up and down the shorelines that you would never believe could have happened. But I think, they had the vision, but, you had LB that had the power to get it done. And Glenn Jackson, those people. Glenn Jackson had the most the vulgar language I've ever heard anyone speak with. My God. But,
He and Ted Halleck.
oh, Ted, yeah. Yeah. There's a Floyd McKay.
Yeah, sure.
He has a book out, and you really need to get it.
What's the title, roughly?
Reporting the Oregon Story.
Reporting the Oregon
Yeah.
Story.
He was kind of the successor to McCall on Channel 8. I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh, yeah.
That's where McCall got his fame, was being the news commentator
Commentator.
on Channel 8. I still remember in high school when he walked out in the Willamette and was complaining about, he'd pull up boots and tires and all this other stuff in the Willamette River.
Mhm.
And on KGW
Oh, yeah.
TV, he was holding this up and saying, our rivers shouldn't have to face this, we can do better.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
basically launched his,
It's a wonderful book.
yeah.
But anyway, here's a quote that he has in his book.
This is about a quote from who? Glenn Jackson?
No, Floyd McKay.
Oh, okay.
Reporting the Oregon Story, that's the book, described LB as a force of nature who could fix with his withering stare and thundering voice on a detractor and peel the very skin from his frame. That was LB Day.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was,
I'm amazed.
I don't
about
think
that.
anyone else could have led that initiative through.
Well, he had
without him.
the patience at times when he didn't really have the patience, and he had to deal with a lot of technical stuff, which he really didn't have all the knowledge about. But he
When you've
knew-
got hearings that start at 8 o'clock in the morning and
I
end
know.
at midnight, that guy would listen to anything and anyone.
Well, he was gonna, let you have your say.
Mhm.
And then once that was done, the commission took over and made its decision.
Yeah,
And that was hard for some people to take, is that, hey, wait a minute, that is what I said. And,
Mm.
well, the commission saw it differently. And of course, our staff reports,
yeah,
would sustain what the commission, in most cases, wanted it to do.
yeah.
And, not always. And of course, the commission always didn't have one body. They would have divisive votes and
Mhm.
discussions and so forth. It was an amazing, performance.
Yeah.
So do you think it's possible that SB 100, Senate Bill 100, would be approved today by the Oregon legislature?
No, I don't think so.
Explain.
Well, I think,
I'm not saying I disagree with you. I'm just
Yeah,
saying.
yeah. we don't have the common focus we used to have. I mean, look at Congress. And to an extent, the legislature here. It's too
Too partisan?
partisan, and I think we could, yeah, I just think you could not recreate it. I think the time it was done back in 73 and 74 and 5 was just the prime time to have it done. I don't think it could have been done much time after that. I mean, had we let it go longer, there would have been so much more development on the coast, more sprawl, and we couldn't have, it was over then, it would be over then, we
Yeah.
couldn't have controlled it. There's no reason to even do it.
Is the state land use program equipped to address and properly respond to major changes in Oregon? Population, these are examples: population growth, economy, climate change, environment, affordable housing over the next 30 to 40 years, or do you think some changes are necessary?
This was at number 13.
14.
14, actually, yeah, question 14.
Yeah, I don't know, I've been out of the land use program so long, it's hard to think that would,
We're going to talk more about housing a little bit. I know you had your background, went from land use to housing, but.
I don't, things have changed. I mean, given the goals and as it relates to housing and so on, building, what happens with an earthquake? Tremendous earthquake.
Yeah.
I mean, do we have a special set of requirements that are going to, accommodate those 10 years of rebuild? Or, what do you do with the houses that are flat?
Yeah.
And you've got to rebuild, you have to house people. I don't know whether
Yeah,
seems to me that's will be a challenge.
for sure.
But
Okay, let's see.
I think the word evaluation needs to be discussed of the program. I guess you might say every time we did something, that was an evaluation in a micro sense, but how are we doing, say, on goal 17?
mhm.
Or 18? Or 5, or 10, or what have you. I don't have answers to those questions, but I think future commissions need to have that information, especially if we're going to deal with some of these almost intractable problems like climate change. What's Oregon going to do?
Mhm.
And then within Oregon, what's our agency going to do?
Yeah.
And those are tough questions. I don't have answers to those things, but we can't just keep looking over our shoulder. We have to look ahead. And what does that mean? I'm not exactly sure. How would that be done? Every 5 years, 10 years, what have you? And I'd like to see what people think about that. We don't really have that here. We may talk about it. You might want to bring it up some more, but
Has the commission ever set benchmarks in terms of this is what this goal
We
is
had the
intended to
big-
do, and
the
this is
big-
how we're going to measure its success or not, and if
the
it is
task
not
force.
succeeding, this is how we're going to amend it.
I don't know that they came across with benchmarks as the actual concept for each of the goals. I know that way back when I started working with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Experiment Station, we came up with criteria that we got the Forest Service to help us in measuring changes to land use. And with that, we were able to keep track, again, working with Department of Forestry, they were able to come up with reports to show how much land had been converted, resource land, both farm and forestry land converted, and compared that to like Washington often, because they were the neighboring state.
Yeah.
And we were doing remarkably well, I think, by comparison. And that's kind of as close as I know of, at least with respect to the part of the program I worked with, which basically was rural and forestry and farming issues. We were able to keep track, and I think they still do that, I hope. I don't know. Of course, I've been gone too for many years. But as far as housing, I don't know that we've done anything on that, although they could have. That's not the area that I
Yeah.
worked in, so.
Yeah.
I'd like to see something coming out of this round of interviews that would address that issue in some way, the evaluation question. I'm not saying they're all going to be the same point of view, but it would be good to have that subject raised. And that's not our decision.
No.
That's Portland State's decision, and right now they're focused primarily on the housing. But there's more to the program than just housing, obviously.
Yeah.
And I'd like to have some of the people being interviewed would sort of second that. Okay.
That question about whether we could redo the coastal goals or whatever. I think there is. I hate to say this, but maybe Mr. Trump is giving us something. But if the population starts looking at, well, somebody's going to put oil and gas off of our coast, if someone's going to take our monument away, if somebody, these major changes he's doing, see, that's a way to get people back together
Yeah, this is true.
Before it's too late.
before it's
Yeah.
too late. Yeah.
Yeah,
Excuse me.
and I hope Oregon stands up for itself if
Yeah.
something like that, if there's a land grab or trying to take federal land and, move it into private sector hands. I hope Oregonians would stand up for,
Oh, we got the right governor for it.
yeah.
Mm.
I'm going to finish up with 16 here. If you were again involved in such an undertaking and had the chance to influence the development of a new comprehensive land use planning program, what lessons learned from Oregon's approach would you borrow, and which aspects of Oregon's land use program might you avoid?
Yeah, my answer to that was 2 words. Good question. I had to think about it.
You liked our approach, you liked the citizen involvement approach, so I'm guessing you'd keep that.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Were there any practices that went on in your mind that you would change if you had a chance while you were at the department? You know, did we do things in a direction where you wished we'd gone in a different direction? I guess, is that?
I think most of those cases were a learning process. We made mistakes and we went back and corrected it and we didn't do it again.
Yeah.
But I think we could have bonded a little better with some of our partner agencies.
Okay.
I think there's a chance, maybe we could have worked more closely with housing. You know, Bob would come over and testify, participate, give us input and so on, but affordable housing, homeless, there are things we could have maybe brought some of that stuff together and worked together more closely.
I'm just throwing this out as a concept. Would it have been an advantage to have state agencies go through the evaluation process before local governments did it? I know we probably felt the urgency at the time to get, because they thought land was being consumed and destroyed, you know. I know the sagebrush subdivisions that were going on when McCall was concerned about that. But if you had to do it again, would it have been better to get the state agencies lined up with the program and evaluated under state agency coordination, and then have them be an active participant when you go out to talk to local governments and help local governments identify state interests and have them identified in local plans? Is that a...
Yeah, I think that
Might
would have
be.
been really helpful because we had economic development. I worked with economic development, Dan Goldie and Roger Ice over there in different times, and they were hands off.
Well,
It
that-
took a while to get that agreement
Yeah.
together between them and some technical assistance and books and whatever.
I mean, we had that
I mean-
with forestry too, you know,
Yeah,
at the beginning.
yeah.
It was
Had we
like,
got them on board first,
Yeah.
had they thoroughly understood the advantage of using the land use program for
Yeah.
themselves,
and it wasn't until you did state agency coordination with forestry that they became really one of the strongest advocates for the program. When Ted and
Mhm.
Kevin and the others ended up going through that exercise, they ended up being the ones to say, yeah, you can help us. We can protect forest land that we need to have protected,
Yeah.
and habitat that they needed to have protected as well,
Yeah.
through this program.
The statute said to agencies you had to, for those programs that affected land use, which is a nice lofty phrase too, but comply with the goals and, you know, follow local plans that have been acknowledged. Easy words to say, but what does that really mean? And if I were, say, forestry, you know, or fish and wildlife, or water resources, I'd want to get you to not mesh, but connect 197, 180 with some of these agency statutes and directives. I mean, they had things on the same plane as we did in terms of, you know, the legislature spoke and the governor signed something, and that was the statutes they had to follow. Well, what did that actually mean? We never really sat down to the depth that we probably needed to as we look back now. And that's part of the thing, maybe what Mike is saying too, is an evaluation is not just of what what we've done with the goals per se, but how are we working together
Mhm.
with local governments and with other agencies, and how are the agencies working with us and with local governments? And those are hard questions to answer. But if we're gonna continue on, we ought to face the music.
Yeah.
It's easy, again, to say these things, but, and of course, that would take money and time, and you'd have to get some consensus out there with interest groups, so forth, so. I mean, we all care about the program deeply, if we're really honest, from different
Yeah.
perspectives and so forth. We don't want to see it grievously injured or ignored or whatever the negatives would be. But what do we want? And what does the commission, what does the state of Oregon want? And we can't expect them to answer all those questions, but they ought to start moving in that direction, whatever that means.
Well, you're kind of asking a question about, do local plans still reflect the state's interest?
Because that's the
And-
whole big thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that was something that I think, we didn't really know periodic review, what it entailed and how it got interpreted.
Mhm.
But that program kind of went away a little bit. I mean, it may be going on in some aspects. And I know some jurisdictions do it for their own health of their planning program, those that still are active in it. But there's others that don't probably do it at all, and I don't know that the state asks for that to be done anymore. At least to the degree that you can find out now, after 40 years, whether these plans still do reflect the state's interest or not. I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Tough issues, and regional problem solving is something I don't know much about at all.
Yeah.
But isn't that where we have, in a local area of the state, say, parts of Jackson County, I'm just pulling that out of the air, and you get the key agencies that are involved with Jackson County and the key
Mhm.
state agencies, and to some extent, even the federal agencies,
If need
around
be.
a table
Mhm.
to resolve and address some of these problems,
Yeah.
whatever they
Yeah.
may be.
Well, you bring the citizens in. I remember the
citizens.
experience that I had in Josephine County. I forgot who we were talking to, but it took 10 years to do a decent regional problem-solving program, and the legislature got impatient because they said we should have done it in 5, but you can't bring people along
Yeah.
based on whatever pace they need, to do the job. And we had a good, it ended up being a good program.
And frankly, county commissioners and planning commissioners and citizens don't know much about the program today. And I'm not being unfair, I'm just saying that there's a lot of things that we've done and accomplished, and also things that are lying out in front of us. How do we communicate that? And I don't want to use the word educate, overuse that, but can, inform them about what the program can do. I mean, those are tough questions. And maybe this process can begin to shadow some light on the questions. That's what I hope.
Yeah.
If you were to ask me, what are we hoping to get? Well, it's great to look backwards and read about what people think and said about those days, but what's up ahead? What's up ahead?
Yeah, yeah.
And who's gonna be the leaders for that? And we can't expect county commissioners that maybe don't know much about the program to do that. And of course, there's the whole issue of money and getting those. We spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, more than that, in terms of giving grants to cities and counties, larger communities especially. We don't have that kind of resources anymore,
No.
that I know of.
The good thing is that we're 40 years down the road, and we have a whole new generation
Right.
that doesn't remember where it used to be.
Yeah.
And they're set here, so any change for them is going to be go on.
This is true.
Improvement.
They've basically accepted the
They're not going to tear it
program.
down because they've been living with it.
That's right.
Right.
Okay, on behalf of the Portland State University and those of us involved in this oral history project, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I really appreciate hearing about your role and your thoughts about Oregon's land use program. So thanks for doing it.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
Dick.